Have you ever wondered what secrets die with the ashes of burned mansions? What melodies still echo through ruins that nobody dares to visit after dark? Tonight, I need to share something with you that has haunted me since I first discovered it, buried in old court records from Charleston. Something that powerful families spent fortunes trying to erase from history. Something that still makes the descendants of certain aristocratic bloodlines uncomfortable when they hear a piano playing at night. This is not just another story about slavery. This is the hidden truth about a woman who turned her chains into weapons, her talent into a trap, and her master's own pride into his destruction. A woman whose name was deliberately scratched from documents, whose face was burned from portraits, whose very existence certain people wanted the world to forget. But I found her. And tonight, you will know her too. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that buried truths deserve to breathe again, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I am about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about resistance, about music, and about the devastating power of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Her name was Celestine. And this is how she burned Baron Heinrich von Dreschler's world to the ground. The live oaks still stand along the approach to what remains of Magnolia Grove Plantation, their branches draped with Spanish moss that moves like gray funeral veils in the salt breeze rolling up from the Edisto River. The main avenue, once lined with imported Italian statuary, now leads to nothing but charred foundation stones and a single chimney that rises from the overgrown ruins like a blackened finger pointing accusation at the Carolina sky. Local people still avoid this place after sundown. The old-timers in the Gullah communities along the Sea Islands say you can hear piano music drifting across the marshes on certain nights when the tide comes in, just right, and the wind carries memories from places that time has tried to bury. They say the music is beautiful, heartbreakingly so. And they say it always ends the same way, with a crash of notes, screaming, and then silence that feels heavier than any sound. What happened here on the night of December 23, 1848, was recorded in court documents, military dispatches, and private letters that were supposed to remain sealed for 100 years. Some of those seals were broken early. Some documents disappeared entirely, only to resurface in private collections decades later. The story they tell is one that the antebellum South desperately wanted forgotten, because it exposed a truth that no amount of moonlight and Magnolia's mythology could ever fully conceal. The truth that the enslaved were not passive, that they watched, that they remembered, that they planned, and that sometimes, in ways that shook the very foundations of the slaveholding class, they struck back with a precision and devastation that left their oppressors trembling in their beds for generations afterward. Celestine was born in this place. She died in this place. And in between, she transformed from property into something far more dangerous than any weapon Baron von Dreschler could have imagined sitting in his own parlor, disguised as entertainment. This is her story, the complete story, the one they tried to burn along with everything else. If you want to follow more cases like this one, cases that shake society and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss any investigation. Magnolia Grove Plantation spread across 4,700 acres of Colleton County lowcountry, a vast empire of rice paddies, cotton fields, and indigo processing works that made Baron Heinrich von Dreschler one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. The property had been carved from the Carolina wilderness 3 generations earlier by the first Dreschler to arrive from the German principalities, a minor nobleman whose gambling debts had made Europe inhospitable and whose ruthlessness had made America profitable. By 1848, the estate had grown into something that resembled a small kingdom more than a farm. The main house alone contained 43 rooms, including a ballroom with crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna, a library housing over 6,000 volumes in 7 languages, and a music room that was the particular pride of the current baron. This music room featured floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the formal gardens, walls covered in silk damask the color of dried blood, and at its center, a Bösendorfer grand piano that had been shipped from Austria at a cost that could have purchased 20 enslaved human beings. That piano would become the instrument of the baron's destruction. The enslaved population of Magnolia Grove numbered 347 souls at the time of the 1848 census, though this number fluctuated constantly through births, deaths, sales, and purchases. They lived in a network of wooden cabins arranged in precise rows behind the main house, each structure identical to the next, each containing between 4 and 8 people depending on the season and the Baron's current labor calculations. The cabins had dirt floors, no windows, and chimneys that leaked smoke so badly that respiratory ailments killed more enslaved people than any other cause except the rice paddies themselves. The rice cultivation was the source of Magnolia Grove's wealth, and also the source of its particular brutality. The low-country rice plantations of South Carolina operated on what historians would later call the task system, where enslaved workers were assigned specific daily tasks that had to be completed before they were allowed to rest. This might sound more humane than the gang labor system used on cotton plantations, but in practice it was often worse. The tasks were calculated to be nearly impossible to complete in the available daylight hours, which meant that enslaved people worked from before dawn until well after dark, standing in knee-deep water under a subtropical sun that bred mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. The mortality rate for enslaved rice workers was staggering. Some plantations lost a quarter of their enslaved population in a single bad year. Magnolia Grove was not much better. The Baron kept meticulous records of his property, both human and otherwise, and those records show that the average life expectancy for an enslaved person arriving at Magnolia Grove as an adult was less than 7 years. 7 years of standing in snake-infested water, 7 years of breathing in the miasma that rose from the paddies, 7 years of watching children die from fevers, watching elders collapse in the fields, watching the bodies piled onto carts and hauled to the burial ground in the swamp, where no headstones marked the graves because headstones cost money and the dead produced no labor. This was the world into which Celestine was born in the summer of 1822, in a cabin that sat at the end of the third row, closest to the big house where the Baron and his family lived in comfort that depended entirely on the suffering of people like her. Her mother, Esther, was what the plantation records called a house servant, though this term obscures the reality of her position. Esther had been purchased specifically for her skills as a seamstress, her light skin, and what the slave trader's advertisement had described as her refined manner. She worked inside the main house, mending clothes, making curtains, and performing whatever other tasks the Baroness required. She also, as was common on plantations where enslaved women had no legal right to refuse, bore children whose father's name was never recorded, but whose light complexion told its own story. Celestine was Esther's third child, and the only one to survive past infancy. She inherited her mother's light brown skin, her grandmother's height, and from some distant ancestor whose African name had been stripped away generations ago, she inherited something that would change everything: an extraordinary gift for music. The gift revealed itself early. By the age of 3, Celestine was humming melodies she had heard only once, reproducing them with perfect pitch. By 5, she was picking out tunes on the broken piano that had been relegated to a storage room in the house, a cast-off instrument that the Baron's first wife had played before her death. By 7, she was teaching herself to read music from the sheet music she found in that same storage room, hidden behind crates of old china and forgotten furniture. The Baron discovered her gift by accident on an afternoon in 1829, when he was walking through the servant corridors on his way to inspect some repair work, and heard sounds coming from the storage room that stopped him in his tracks. He opened the door to find a 7-year-old enslaved girl seated at a decrepit piano, playing a Bach invention with more feeling and technical accuracy than his own daughters had ever managed, despite years of expensive lessons from imported European tutors. What happened next would seal Celestine's fate, and set in motion a chain of events that would end in fire and blood, 19 years later. Instead of punishing her for touching property that did not belong to her, the Baron saw an opportunity. He had always prided himself on his cultural refinement, on being different from the rough cotton planters and backwoods farmers who made up much of the Southern aristocracy. He collected art. He subscribed to European journals. He corresponded with intellectuals in Germany and France. And now he realized he could possess something that none of his rivals had: an enslaved musical prodigy who would demonstrate both his sophistication and his absolute power over another human being. He ordered the old piano replaced with a newer instrument. He arranged for Celestine to receive formal training from a music teacher in Charleston, a German immigrant named Klaus Werner, who traveled to the plantation twice monthly. He had a proper dress made for her, modest but of good fabric, so that she would not embarrass him when she performed for his guests. And he made it clear to everyone on the plantation that Celestine was to be exempted from field work and given time to practice, because her value to him now transcended whatever labor she might have provided in the rice paddies. For Celestine, this represented both salvation and a new kind of prison. She was saved from the brutal work that killed so many of her people. She was given access to the big house, to music, to a kind of education that was illegal for enslaved people to receive in South Carolina. But she was also more visibly owned than ever before, trotted out like a trained animal to perform for guests who would applaud her skill, and then discuss whether Negro intelligence was a sign of good breeding or a dangerous aberration. She learned to navigate this world with care. She learned to keep her eyes down when the Baron's friends made comments about her appearance or her abilities. She learned to smile and curtsy and say yes, sir, and no, ma'am, and thank you for the opportunity. She learned to perform not just music, but subservience. And she learned to hide behind that performance the growing fury that no amount of Bach or Beethoven could ever fully quiet. She also learned other things during those years of relative privilege. She learned which floorboards creaked and which did not. She learned where the Baron kept his keys and which ones opened which doors. She learned the schedules of the overseers and the patrol routes of the slave catchers. She learned which white visitors to the plantation were cruel for sport and which merely indifferent. She learned the geography of the house, every room, every passage, every hiding place. And she learned the weaknesses of the man who owned her, his vanity, his temper, his drinking habits, his obsession with proving himself superior to everyone around him. All of this knowledge she stored away like coins in a secret purse, not knowing yet what she would spend it on, but knowing somehow that the day would come when she would need every piece of information she had gathered. That day began to take shape on a September evening in 1841, when Celestine was 19 years old and had been performing for the Baron's guests for 12 years. The evening started like countless others at Magnolia Grove. The Baron was hosting a gathering of neighboring planters, politicians from Charleston, and a visiting delegation of businessmen from England who were interested in investing in Carolina cotton. The guest list included some of the most powerful men in the state, including a state senator, 2 members of prominent banking families, and a lawyer who specialized in defending the institution of slavery against abolitionist attacks. Celestine had been instructed to perform after dinner as usual. She had prepared a program of Mozart, Chopin, and Stephen Foster, a combination designed to demonstrate both classical refinement and American nationalism. She wore a dress that the Baroness had selected, cream-colored muslin with a high collar that marked her as a house servant rather than a field hand, but still made of fabric inferior to what any white woman in the room was wearing. She sat at the Bösendorfer and played. She played beautifully, because she always played beautifully, because her fingers had been trained for so many years that they knew the music better than her conscious mind did. And while she played, she watched. She had learned that she could observe the room reflected in the polished wood of the piano, watching the guests without appearing to watch, reading their faces and their body language while her hands moved independently across the keys. What she saw that night was nothing unusual at first. The men drinking brandy and smoking cigars, the wives and daughters fanning themselves against the September heat, the Baron standing by the fireplace, accepting compliments on his musical possession, with the same proud smile he wore when showing off his horses, the English businessmen nodding along, clearly more interested in the balance sheets they had reviewed earlier than in the performance happening before them. But then she saw something that made her fingers stumble on a phrase she could normally play in her sleep. The Baron had stepped away from the fireplace and was speaking with one of the overseers, a man named Silas Croft, who was not usually invited to social gatherings in the big house. Croft was showing the Baron a piece of paper. The Baron read it, his face changing, his hand tightening on his brandy glass until his knuckles went white. Celestine finished the Mozart and transitioned to Chopin, while the Baron excused himself and left the room. She watched him go in the piano's reflection. She noted which door he used. She noted that Croft followed him. And she noted with a cold certainty that settled in her stomach like a stone that something had happened. Something important. Something that involved her people. She did not find out what until 3 days later, When the news finally reached the slave quarters through the networks of whispered communication that connected every enslaved person on every plantation in the Low Country. There had been an escape attempt. 13 enslaved people from Magnolia Grove had tried to reach the Sea Islands, hoping to find passage on a ship bound for the Bahamas where slavery had been abolished 15 years earlier. They had planned carefully, gathering supplies, mapping routes, waiting for a moonless night. But someone had betrayed them. A slave from a neighboring plantation, promised his freedom in exchange for information, had told the patrol where to find them. The patrol had caught 12 of the 13 escapees in a cypress swamp about 15 miles from the coast. The 13th, a young man named Solomon, who had been the leader of the group, had fought back. The patrol had shot him dead and left his body in the swamp as a warning. Among the 12 who were captured and brought back to Magnolia Grove was Celestine's mother, Esther. The punishment for attempted escape was not just severe, it was theatrical. The Baron understood, as all slaveholders understood, that controlling 300 enslaved people with a handful of overseers required not just physical force, but psychological terror. Every punishment had to be a performance, a demonstration of what happened to those who defied the system. The 12 captured escapees were held in the plantation's jail, a windowless building near the stables that was used for punishment and storage. They were given no food and little water for 3 days while the Baron decided what to do with them. On the 4th day, he announced his decision. The 3 youngest of the escapees, children between the ages of 10 and 14, would be sold immediately. They were put in chains and transported to the Charleston slave market that same afternoon. Their mothers were not allowed to say goodbye. The remaining 9 adults would receive 39 lashes each, administered publicly in front of the entire enslaved population of Magnolia Grove. They would then be assigned to the most brutal labor available, clearing new rice paddies from the swampland on the northern edge of the property, work that was essentially a death sentence given at a slower pace. Celestine was forced to watch her mother whipped until the skin hung from her back in ribbons. She was forced to watch as Esther, 53 years old and already weakened from years of labor and poor nutrition, was dragged from the whipping post and thrown onto a cart that would take her to the swamp clearing crew. She was forced to stand there, in the cream-colored dress that marked her as the Baron's pet, unable to scream, unable to cry, unable to do anything that might provoke further punishment for her mother or herself. But inside, something shifted. Something that had been building for 19 years finally found its shape. Celestine looked at the Baron standing on the porch of the big house, watching his punishment with the same expression he wore when disciplining a dog, mild annoyance mixed with satisfaction at a job properly done. She looked at the overseers laughing as they coiled their whips. She looked at her mother's blood soaking into the red Carolina clay. And she began to plan. Leave in the comments. Never give up on truth if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. The swamp clearing crew was exactly as deadly as everyone knew it would be. The work involved draining sections of cypress swamp, cutting down trees, pulling up roots, and preparing the land for the complex system of dikes and canals that rice cultivation required. The men and women assigned to this work stood in water that reached their chests, breathing air thick with insects and disease, working from dawn to dark with no shelter from the sun or the frequent storms that rolled in from the coast. Esther lasted 6 weeks. Celestine learned of her mother's death from another house servant, a woman named Margaret, who had been allowed to bring water to the clearing crew that morning. Margaret found Celestine in the storage room where she practiced, the same room where her gift had been discovered all those years ago. She delivered the news in a whisper, knowing that any display of grief from an enslaved person could be punished as insubordination. Esther had collapsed in the water just after noon. The overseer had ordered 2 other workers to drag her body to dry ground, where they discovered she was still breathing but too weak to stand. She died before sunset, lying on a pile of cut cypress branches, burning with fever, calling for her daughter in a voice too faint to be heard more than a few feet away. There was no funeral. There was no mourning period. Esther's body was transported to the burial ground in the swamp and put into an unmarked grave alongside the hundreds of other enslaved people who had died at Magnolia Grove over the decades. Her few possessions, a comb, a ribbon, a small Bible she could not read but kept anyway, were gathered by other enslaved people who would remember her. Nothing else remained to mark that she had ever existed. That night, Celestine sat at the Bosendorfer in the dark music room and played. She played for hours, piece after piece, not caring whether anyone heard her. She played her mother's favorite melodies, songs that Esther had hummed while sewing, songs that had filled their small cabin on the rare evenings when they were together. She played music that she had never performed for the Baron, music that she had kept for herself, music that came from a place inside her that no one had ever been allowed to see. When she finally stopped, just before dawn, her fingers were bleeding where the keys had worn away the skin. She wrapped them in cloth torn from her own petticoat, and then, in the silence of the sleeping plantation, she made a promise. Her mother would be avenged. Not just remembered. Avenged. The Baron would pay. The overseers would pay. The system that had killed her mother and so many others would pay. She did not know yet how. She did not know when. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would find a way, and that when she struck, she would strike in a way that the Baron and everyone like him would never forget. The next 7 years of Celestine's life were dedicated to preparing for that moment. The Baron's household in 1848 represented a particular configuration of cruelty that Celestine had spent years mapping and understanding. At its center sat Baron Heinrich von Dreschler himself, now 61 years old, grown fat on the wealth extracted from enslaved labor, increasingly paranoid about the abolitionists he read about in northern newspapers, but still vain enough to believe himself a cultured gentleman superior to the common planters around him. His second wife, Baroness Margaret, was 20 years younger and primarily concerned with maintaining her social position among the Charleston elite. She had brought 2 daughters from a previous marriage, both now married to other planters' sons and living on their own properties. She treated the enslaved people of Magnolia Grove with cold indifference, as if they were furniture that occasionally needed to be disciplined. The Baron's son from his first marriage, Friedrich, was 34 years old and served as the plantation's day-to-day manager. He had inherited his father's cruelty without his father's pretensions to culture. Where the Baron might punish an enslaved person with regret, as if disciplining an errant child, Friedrich punished with obvious pleasure. He was known among the enslaved community as the Wolf, a name that captured both his predatory nature and the way he circled the quarters after dark, looking for women he could force into his cabin. The overseers formed another layer of terror. Silas Croft, the head overseer, had worked at Magnolia Grove for 23 years and knew the plantation's operations better than anyone alive. He was not unnecessarily cruel in the way Friedrich was, but he was efficient, which in many ways was worse. He calculated exactly how much pain was needed to maintain order and applied it with mechanical precision. Under him served 4 assistant overseers, all poor white men from the surrounding counties who had accepted positions at Magnolia Grove because the salary was better than what they could make farming their own exhausted land. Then there was the house staff, the enslaved people who worked in the big house and occupied an ambiguous position between the horrors of field labor and the psychological torment of constant proximity to their owners. Celestine was part of this group, along with approximately 20 others who served as cooks, maids, valets, and general household servants. They lived in slightly better conditions than the field workers, but they also lived under constant surveillance, unable to speak freely or move freely, or think freely without risking discovery and punishment. Among this household staff, Celestine had identified the people she could trust and the people she could not. She had spent years testing loyalties, sharing small secrets to see if they would be betrayed, offering small kindnesses to see how they would be received. By 1848, she had assembled a network of 5 people who she believed would follow her when the time came. First was Gabriel, the Baron's personal valet, a man of about 50 who had been purchased from a plantation in Virginia 30 years earlier. Gabriel had access to the Baron's private rooms, his schedule, his correspondence, and most importantly, his keys. He moved through the house like a shadow, noticed only when the Baron needed something, invisible the rest of the time. He had lost a wife to Sale and 2 sons to the rice paddies, and his hatred for the Dreschler family burned with a cold flame that Celestine recognized in herself. Second was Ruth, the head cook, who controlled the kitchen and everything that passed through it. Ruth knew which herbs helped and which herbs harmed, knowledge passed down through generations of African healers that had survived the Middle Passage and slavery, to emerge in the gardens that enslaved people tended behind their cabins. She was 60 years old and had no expectation of living much longer, but she wanted to see the big house burn before she died. Third was Thomas, a young man of 20 who worked in the stables and had been caught trying to run north 2 years earlier. He had survived his punishment, 39 lashes and a month in the plantation jail, but he had emerged changed. The laughing boy who had once dreamed of freedom had been replaced by a silent man who spoke to almost no one and watched everything with eyes that never seemed to blink. Fourth was Mary, Ruth's niece, who served as a maid in the big house and had access to the bedrooms and private chambers. Mary was 19 and had caught Friedrich's attention in a way that terrified everyone who knew her. So far, she had managed to avoid being alone with him, but it was only a matter of time. Her urgency was different from the others, more immediate, more desperate, but no less certain. Fifth was an elderly man called Prophet by everyone on the plantation, though his given name was Samuel. Prophet did not work in the big house. He worked in the fields despite his age, and would have seemed an unlikely conspirator except for one thing: he could read and write. He had learned decades ago from a white minister who believed that enslaved people should be able to read the Bible, and he had preserved this dangerous skill in secret ever since. He kept the records that Celestine needed, the names and dates and details that would eventually make their way out of South Carolina and into the hands of abolitionists who would ensure the story was never forgotten. These 5 people met with Celestine in secret, always in different locations, always at different times, always with cover stories prepared in case they were discovered. They communicated through a system of signals that Celestine had developed, using the music she played in the big house to convey messages to those who knew how to listen. A particular phrase played twice meant a meeting that night. A song interrupted and restarted meant danger and delay. A song played backward from end to beginning meant that the plan was moving forward. The plan itself was simple in concept and staggeringly complex in execution. Celestine intended to burn Magnolia Grove to the ground, but not randomly, not chaotically. She intended to do it in a way that would kill the Baron and his family, destroy the records that documented the enslaved people as property, and create enough confusion to allow as many enslaved people as possible to escape into the swamps and make their way to the Sea Islands, where they might find passage to freedom. The method she chose was one that would be named after her in the terrified reports that plantation owners would exchange for years afterward. It would be called, with a mixture of horror and reluctant admiration, the Celestine Method, using the trusted position of a house servant to transform an ordinary social gathering into an inescapable trap. The key to the plan was the Baron's Christmas party. Every year on December 23rd, the Baron hosted what he called his winter celebration, a lavish gathering that brought together the leading families of the Low Country for an evening of dining, dancing, and display. The date was chosen deliberately, close enough to Christmas to capture the holiday spirit, but far enough away that it did not conflict with the private family celebrations that would follow. The event was one of the social highlights of the Charleston season, and an invitation to Magnolia Grove's winter celebration was a mark of status that planters' wives coveted and competed for. The 1848 celebration was planned to be particularly extravagant. The Baron had recently completed a renovation of the ballroom, adding new chandeliers and a painted ceiling that depicted scenes from Greek mythology. He had ordered cases of champagne from France, hothouse flowers from Charleston, and a small orchestra from Savannah to supplement Celestine's piano performances. The guest list included over 80 people, among them some of the wealthiest and most powerful slaveholders in South Carolina. Celestine saw the party as her opportunity. She would have access to the entire house. She would be expected to move through different rooms as part of her performing duties. And most importantly, the chaos of a large gathering would provide cover for the preparations she needed to make. She spent months working out the details. Gabriel would unlock certain doors and provide copies of keys that Celestine needed. Ruth would prepare the food, including special dishes for the Baron's table that would ensure he and his family were too ill to escape when the fire started. Thomas would position barrels of lamp oil near the foundation of the house, disguised as supplies for the party's lighting. Mary would ensure that certain windows and doors were blocked or locked from the inside. Prophet would coordinate with contacts in the enslaved community to spread the word about what was coming and organize the escape that would follow. The timing was critical. The fire had to start after the party was well underway, when the alcohol had flowed freely and the guests' attention was scattered. It had to spread quickly enough to trap the people inside, but slowly enough to give the enslaved workers time to get away from the burning building. And it had to happen on a night when the patrol was expected to be thin, since many of the patrol riders would be attending the party themselves or taking the holiday as an opportunity to visit their own families. December 23, 1848, arrived cold and clear, with a wind out of the northwest that would carry sparks exactly where Celestine needed them to go. The final hours before the winter celebration unfolded with a terrible normalcy that Celestine would remember for the rest of her short life. The kitchen bustled with Ruth's preparations, the smell of roasting meat and baking bread filling the air. The house staff moved through the rooms, dusting, polishing, arranging flowers, their hands performing familiar tasks, while their minds turned over the plans they had rehearsed in whispered midnight conversations. Celestine dressed in the gown the Baroness had chosen for her, a blue silk dress that was finer than anything she had ever worn, selected specifically because it would complement the new decorations in the ballroom. She looked at herself in the small mirror in the room where she changed, a room that was not hers, in a house that was not hers, wearing clothes that were not hers, and she felt for a moment the strange displacement of existing in a world that denied her existence. Then she thought of her mother. She thought of the whipping post, and the swamp, and the unmarked grave. And the displacement vanished, replaced by a clarity of purpose that was almost peaceful. At 6 o'clock, the first carriages began arriving. Celestine watched from a window as the low-country aristocracy descended upon Magnolia Grove. The men in their dark suits, and the women in their bright gowns, their laughter carrying across the cold evening air. She saw faces she recognized from previous performances, men who had complimented her playing and then discussed whether Negroes had souls, women who had smiled at her music and then examined her like livestock at auction. By 8 o'clock, the party was in full swing. Celestine had performed her first set in the music room, a selection of holiday tunes and classical pieces that had received the usual polite applause. Now she moved through the house, ostensibly to prepare for her next performance, actually to check on the preparations she and her conspirators had made. The oil barrels were in position, Thomas had confirmed with a slight nod as he passed her in the hallway. The doors were secured, Mary had signaled with a touch to her hair. The Baron's dinner had been served, Ruth had communicated through a messenger, and the special ingredients were beginning to take effect. Gabriel had placed himself near the Baron's study, ready to unlock the door to the room where the plantation records were kept. At 9 o'clock, Celestine returned to the ballroom for her final performance. The guests were gathered now. Perhaps 70 people crowded into the renovated space beneath the new chandeliers that glittered with hundreds of candles. The Baron stood near the center of the room, his face flushed from champagne and rich food, accepting congratulations on the success of his party. Beside him, the Baroness smiled her cold smile, while Friedrich prowled the edges of the crowd, his eyes following the servant girls with undisguised hunger. Celestine took her place at the Bosendorfer and began to play. She had chosen this piece carefully. It was a mazurka by Chopin, melancholy and beautiful, the kind of music that encouraged contemplation rather than conversation. The guests gradually fell silent as she played, their attention drawn to the piano and the enslaved woman whose fingers danced across the keys with a skill that none of them would ever acknowledge as fully human. As she played, Celestine watched the room in the reflection of the polished piano wood. She saw Gabriel slip out through a side door. She saw Thomas move past a window outside, carrying what looked like a lantern, but was actually the first of the fire-starting materials. She saw Mary position herself near the main entrance, ready to perform her part when the moment came. The mazurka ended. Celestine paused, her hands resting on the keys. And then, because she could not help herself, because this moment deserved something more than just another pretty tune for people who would never see her as human, she began to play something else. Something she had never performed for the Baron or his guests. Something that had been forbidden to her, to all enslaved people, since before she was born. She played a spiritual. The music rolled out from the piano, slow at first, then building in intensity. It was a song about freedom, about crossing over Jordan, about reaching a promised land that the enslaved people of the South sang in their cabins and their fields when they thought no white person could hear. It was a song of defiance and hope and survival, and Celestine played it now with all the skill she had developed over 26 years of enforced training, transforming it from a simple melody into something transcendent. The guests stirred uncomfortably. Some recognized what they were hearing. Others simply sensed that something was wrong, that the music had shifted from entertainment to challenge. The Baron's face darkened as he pushed through the crowd toward the piano. But before he could reach her, before he could demand an explanation or order her punishment, the first scream came from outside. The stables were on fire. What happened next occurred so quickly that survivors would later struggle to reconstruct the sequence of events. The fire in the stables, set by Thomas with the oil he had been positioning for weeks, spread to the outbuildings with terrifying speed. The wind from the northwest, which Celestine had counted on, carried burning embers onto the roof of the big house, where they found the additional oil that had been spread across the wooden shingles. Within minutes, the main house was burning from above. The guests rushed for the exits, only to find that several doors were locked or blocked. The windows, which had been painted shut years ago to keep out the Carolina summer heat, refused to open. Smoke began pouring into the ballroom as the ceiling above crackled with flame. In the chaos, Celestine moved with purpose. She had planned for this moment. She knew exactly where to go. She made her way to the Baron's study, where Gabriel was already waiting with the door unlocked. Inside, she found the ledgers that recorded the enslaved people of Magnolia Grove as property, the bills of sale and breeding records and punishment logs that documented generations of human misery. She gathered what she could carry and fed the rest to the fire that was already licking at the walls. Then she went to find the Baron. She found him in the hallway outside the ballroom, struggling against the press of panicked guests. He was screaming orders that no one was obeying, demanding that his servants save his paintings, his books, his precious possessions. When he saw Celestine, his face contorted with rage. He knew. In that moment, looking at the enslaved woman who had entertained his guest for so many years, he understood what had happened. He understood that his property had turned against him, that the piano-playing prodigy he had shown off like a trained monkey had been planning his destruction all along. He reached for her, his hands grasping at her blue silk dress, tearing the fabric. She did not fight him. She simply stood there, looking into his eyes, as the ceiling above them began to collapse. The last thing the Baron saw was Celestine's smile. The fire burned through the night. By dawn, Magnolia Grove's main house was nothing but smoking ruins. The stables, the outbuildings, the storage sheds, all destroyed. The slave quarters had been spared, whether by accident or design, but the cabins stood empty. Over 200 enslaved people had disappeared into the swamps during the chaos, following routes that Prophet had helped them memorize in the weeks before the fire. The death toll among the white guests was staggering. 43 people died in the fire, including the Baron, the Baroness, and Friedrich. Several of the most prominent families in South Carolina had lost members. The social and political implications would ripple through the Low Country for years. Celestine was among the dead, though her body was never positively identified. Some survivors claimed to have seen her escape through a window. Others said she had chosen to remain in the burning building, standing at the piano until the flames took her. The truth was never established. What was established, through court documents and military investigations and the testimony of the few white survivors, was that the fire had not been an accident. It had been arson. It had been planned. It had been carried out by enslaved people who had decided that they would rather die fighting than continue living in chains. If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. The aftermath of the Magnolia Grove fire sent shockwaves through the slaveholding South that lasted for years. Within days of the disaster, militias were mobilized across Colleton County and the surrounding regions. Slave patrols tripled in size. Any enslaved person found away from their plantation without a pass was subject to immediate arrest and punishment without investigation. The search for the escaped Magnolia Grove slaves continued for months. Some were captured and returned, facing punishment so severe that several died. Others managed to reach the Sea Islands, and from there found passage to the Bahamas, to Jamaica, to any place where they might live without chains. Still others disappeared into the vast swamp networks of the Low Country, joining communities of escaped enslaved people, called Maroons, who had been living free in the wilderness for generations. Among those never captured was Gabriel, who had escaped carrying documents that he eventually smuggled to abolitionists in the North. These documents included plantation records, letters, and a handwritten account of the fire that he claimed Celestine had dictated to him in the weeks before her death. This account, published in abolitionist newspapers in 1849, became one of the most widely read testimonies of enslaved resistance in the antebellum period. Ruth was captured 3 weeks after the fire, hiding in a cabin on an abandoned farm about 20 miles from Magnolia Grove. She was returned to the estate's new owners, a consortium of the Baron's creditors who had purchased the property at auction, and sentenced to be whipped to death as an example. She died after the 37th stroke, reportedly without making a sound. Thomas was never seen again. Some said he had drowned trying to cross a river during his escape. Others said he had made it all the way to Canada. Others still said he had joined a Maroon community deep in the swamps and lived there until after the Civil War, when he emerged to help guide Union troops through territory he knew better than any map could show. Mary survived. She escaped during the fire, made her way to the coast, and eventually reached Philadelphia, where she lived as a free woman under an assumed name. She married, had children, and never spoke of Magnolia Grove to anyone except, reportedly, a single interview given to a historian in 1892, when she was 63 years old. In that interview, she confirmed the basic facts of the Celestine method and added one detail that had never been recorded before. The signal that had told the conspirators to begin the fire had been the spiritual that Celestine played at the end of her final performance. Prophet died in the swamps 3 days after the fire, from injuries sustained during the escape. His body was found by other escapees, who buried him according to the African traditions he had taught them, traditions that had survived slavery and the Middle Passage and centuries of suppression. They marked his grave with a pattern of shells and stones that could still be seen, if you knew where to look, more than a century later. The Magnolia Grove fire became something more than just a historical event. It became a legend, a myth, a story that enslaved people whispered to each other in the darkness of their cabins across the South. The story changed with each telling, as stories do. In some versions, Celestine was a sorceress who had called down fire from heaven. In others, she was an angel of vengeance sent to punish the wicked. In still others, she was simply a woman who had decided that enough was enough. The slaveholders had their own version of the story, of course. In their telling, the fire was proof of the inherent danger of educating enslaved people, of allowing them any contact with the refinements of civilization. They pointed to Celestine as an example of why slaves should be kept ignorant and brutalized, why even the appearance of kindness was a weakness that could be exploited. Both versions contained the same kernel of truth. An enslaved woman had used the very gifts her master had cultivated in her to destroy him. The piano that was supposed to demonstrate his sophistication had become the instrument of his doom. The trust he had placed in his property had been his fatal mistake. In the years after the fire, reports of similar incidents began appearing across the South. Fires at plantation houses that were blamed on enslaved domestic workers, poisonings that couldn't be traced, accidents that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. Whether these events were actually connected to the Magnolia Grove fire, whether they were inspired by Celestine's example, or whether they had been happening all along and were only now being noticed, no one could say for certain. What could be said was that the planters were afraid. For the first time in generations, they looked at the enslaved people who served them their meals and dressed them and played music for their entertainment, and they wondered what thoughts were hiding behind those carefully blank faces. The fear did not lead to reform. It led to crackdowns, to harsher punishments, to new laws restricting the movement and education of enslaved people. The system of slavery was too profitable, too deeply embedded in the Southern economy and identity, to be abandoned because of a single fire at a single plantation. But the fear remained, a constant undercurrent beneath the confident facade of the antebellum South, A recognition that the institution of slavery rested on a foundation of violence that could be turned against its creators at any moment. The ruins of Magnolia Grove stand to this day in a remote corner of Colleton County, accessible only by dirt roads that flood during the frequent Carolina rains. The property changed hands many times after the fire, never regaining its former prosperity. Each successive owner attempted to rebuild, and each eventually abandoned the effort, citing financial difficulties, bad luck, or in one case, a simple inability to remain on land that felt wrong in ways the owner couldn't articulate. The live oaks still stand along the approach, older now, their moss longer, their branches reaching toward a house that no longer exists. The formal gardens have long since returned to wilderness, the Italian statuary swallowed by vines and undergrowth. Only the single chimney remains of the great house, rising from the ruins like a monument to what happened here and what it meant. The local people still avoid the place after dark. They still talk about hearing piano music on certain nights, carried on the wind from the direction of the ruins. They still tell stories about Celestine, stories that have grown and changed with time, but have never been forgotten. In some versions, she is a ghost who haunts the ruins, forever playing the piano that no longer exists. In others, she is a spirit of resistance who appears to those who need courage in their own struggles against oppression. In still others, she is simply a woman, an extraordinarily talented, extraordinarily brave woman who made a choice and paid the price and left behind a legacy that refuses to die. Among the descendants of the people who escaped Magnolia Grove that night, the story has a different tone. They speak of Celestine with pride, with reverence, with something approaching worship. They keep her memory alive through oral traditions that have passed from generation to generation, adding details that may or may not be historically accurate, but that capture the emotional truth of what she represented. They visit the ruins when they can, leaving offerings at the base of the chimney, flowers and coins and small pieces of paper with prayers written on them. They remember her not as a victim, not as a curiosity, not as an example of what happens when slaves are treated too kindly. They remember her as a hero, as a warrior, as someone who refused to accept that her life and the lives of her people meant nothing. They remember her as Celestine. Historians continue to debate the significance of the Magnolia Grove fire and the woman who allegedly planned it. Some argue that events like this one, scattered and individual as they were, represented a constant undercurrent of resistance that challenged the image of the passive, contented slave that slaveholders wanted the world to believe. Others argue that such events were exceptional, that the vast majority of enslaved people had no choice but to accommodate themselves to a system too powerful to be overthrown through individual acts of violence. Both perspectives contain truth. The system of slavery was indeed too powerful to be destroyed by a single fire, or even 100 fires. It would take a civil war, the bloodiest conflict in American history, to finally break the chains that had bound millions of human beings for centuries. And even then, the legacy of slavery would persist in new forms of oppression and violence that continue to shape American society to this day. But the resistance mattered too. It mattered to the people who resisted, who reclaimed their agency and their humanity through acts of defiance that the system was designed to make impossible. It mattered to the slaveholders, who could never quite forget that their power rested on a foundation of fear, and that the people they claimed to own were never fully under their control. And it mattered to history, which is not just a record of what happened, but a story about what we choose to remember and why. Celestine chose to be remembered. She could have lived out her life as the Baron's musical pet, playing pretty tunes for pretty parties, surviving by submission, dying eventually in the relative comfort of her special position. Instead, she chose to strike back, knowing that it would probably cost her life, knowing that she might fail, knowing that even if she succeeded, she might never see the freedom that her actions were meant to create for others. She made that choice anyway, and in making it, she became something more than just an enslaved woman who set fire to a plantation house. She became a symbol, a story, a name that would be spoken in whispers for generations, by people who needed to believe that resistance was possible, that oppression could be challenged, that the powerful were not as invulnerable as they wanted everyone to believe. The powerful have always tried to suppress such stories. They have always tried to make resistance seem futile, to make the oppressed believe that there is no alternative but submission. They have always tried to erase the names of those who fought back, to ensure that their examples are forgotten. But the stories survive. The names survive. The examples survive. Celestine survives. Like this video if the story of Celestine touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of Celestine will never be forgotten. On certain nights, when the wind comes in from the northwest and the tide rises in the Edisto River, the people who live near the ruins of Magnolia Grove say they can hear music drifting across the marshes. It is piano music, they say, beautiful and sad and fierce all at once. It rises and falls with the wind, sometimes barely audible, sometimes so clear that it seems to be coming from just around the corner. They say the music tells a story, if you listen closely enough. A story about a woman who was never supposed to be anything more than property, who was never supposed to have thoughts or dreams or the capacity for vengeance. A woman who took everything her oppressors gave her, the skills they taught her, the access they granted her, the trust they foolishly extended, and turned it all into a weapon. They say the music ends the same way every time. There is a final crashing chord, a sound that might be screaming or might just be the wind, and then silence. A silence that feels heavier than any sound. A silence that asks a question that the living can never quite answer. Was it worth it? Celestine never hesitated. The night she sat down at the Bosendorfer for the last time. The night she played a forbidden spiritual for an audience that had never seen her as human. The night she burned down the world that had enslaved her and everyone she loved. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. She was answering a question that had been asked of her people since the first slave ships arrived on American shores. A question about dignity, about humanity, about the breaking point beyond which no amount of pain or threat or fear can make a person submit to treatment that denies their very existence. The answer she gave was fire. The answer she gave was death, her own included. The answer she gave was a refusal, absolute and irrevocable, to accept a world where people like her were considered less than people. It was not the only answer. It was not necessarily the right answer. It was simply the answer she chose, in a time and place where few choices were available to people like her. And it is an answer that echoes still, in the music that the wind seems to carry across the Carolina Lowcountry, in the stories that are passed down through generations, in the ruins that stand as monuments to both atrocity and resistance, in the question that her life and death continue to pose to everyone who learns her story. What would you do? What would you risk? What would you sacrifice? Celestine answered those questions with everything she had. Now it is your turn to decide what her answers mean.